Okay, the first items that we're going to put in the what we need to know section are cosine squared plus sine squared, which is equal to 1. Now the forms of that are important, if you move the sine squared to the other side by subtracting it, you would be left with this statement: cosine squared is equal to 1 minus that sine squared. Similarly, if you took the cosine squared and you moved it to the other side, you would have sine squared is equal to 1 minus cosine squared, which means whenever you see either of these, we can substitute it for this left side. This substitution right here is very common. The not so common forms would be if I were to take sine squared and move it over here and the 1 and bring it to this left side to generate this statement: cosine squared minus 1 is equal to negative sine squared. This substitution will take place, but not very often. Similarly, if you were to swap places with the 1 and the cosine squared, you would have sine squared minus 1 is equal to negative cosine squared. These two substitutions are very rare, but are the most challenging to remember. Okay, the other identity rules that you're going to use quite often are remembering that tangent is made up of sine over cosine. Cotangent is cosine over sine. Secant can be changed to 1 over cosine, and cosecant can be changed to 1 over sine. So the remaining problems then are going to be using all of these rules combined with some algebraic skills to simplify these trig identities. So if we went to problem number 1 here, you need to recognize that this 1 minus cosine squared is right here, and we can replace it with sine squared. So not changing anything in the numerator, changing the denominator to sine squared. So if we simplify right now, this sine can be simplified with the squared, because this is technically sine times sine, so it's just removing one of those signs. I'm left with cosine over sine, which we are going to simplify because we have no fractions, so this is still a fraction. Cosine over sine we know is cotangent. And there's your final answer for problem number 1. Problem number 2, the rules of the algebraic rules that we need to remember. This is subtraction here. We have multiplication, so remembering PEMDAS, we'll have to do this multiplication first. But I would suggest changing all trig functions to the terms of sine and cosine first. If it's already a cosine, we're going to leave it. But all these others we can change so that the problem just contains sines and cosines. So cosecant, if we recall, is 1 over sine. There's that minus. Cosine I'm just going to write right now. Cotangent, change that to cosine over sine. And now do PEMDAS. Do this multiplication here before this subtraction. So I'm going to bring this down. Cosine times cosine is cosine squared all over sine. Now I want to subtract two fractions. So in order to add or subtract two fractions, you have to have a common denominator. This problem already has a common denominator, so I can just combine the two fractions, bringing the common denominator down. On top I would have 1 minus cosine squared. Now those two fractions have become 1. Recognize that the 1 minus cosine squared theta can be replaced with sine squared theta, so I'll do that now. And then simplify by removing a sine from both locations. If we go to problem number 3, everything in this problem is in terms of sine and cosine, so there's nothing to change there. I have no substitution to make from our list of things that we need to know at the top, so this becomes a matter of adding these two fractions together. Now this isn't a fraction, but I can certainly make it a fraction by putting it over 1. In order to add or subtract fractions, I have to have a common denominator, so the common denominator is going to be cosine. So this fraction doesn't change, but I have to put cosine below here. Well, if you multiply this denominator by cosine, you have to multiply the numerator by it. Thus, that makes the numerator cosine squared. Now you can combine these into one fraction, sine squared plus cosine squared, all over cosine. And hopefully you recognize from your what to know list on top, sine squared plus cosine squared, or vice versa, since they're being added together, it's the same, is equal to 1. So this is just 1 over cosine. 1 over cosine is a fraction, and since we're not having fractions on this page, we're going to change that to secant.